start, if that sounds good. So thank you all for joining us for our BSEC seminar series, where we get to introduce ourselves to each other and tell the bigger team about the work that we do. And we're very fortunate this morning to have Peter Groffman be presenting. He's a scientist at the Cary Institute in New York, where he's also on faculty at CUNY in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and the Advanced Science Research Center at the Graduate Center at CUNY as well. He studies how microbial processes impact gas exchange, particularly nitrogen between soil and air. And has worked on both rural and urban ecosystems, and in particular on the Baltimore ecosystem study here in Baltimore. So I know many of you know Peter far better than I do. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about his research and what he studies and spends his days doing. I'm going to ask real quick if everyone can please mute except for Peter, just to make sure we don't get too much crosstalk, so that we can hear Peter's talk. So with that, Peter, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. So I'm delighted to be giving a talk. I think this idea of having this monthly seminar series is really a great idea for kind of building some, just building some group dynamics in the BSEC group. I've really enjoyed the talk so far, and so I was very glad to volunteer to give one today. And I'm going to share my screen, and so I'm going to talk a little bit. Today I'm going to talk about the Baltimore ecosystem study, which is in many ways is a kind of a precursor to or a complement to BSEC. And some people are quite familiar with it and others not. And so I thought it would be a good idea to kind of give it a little bit of an overview of it. Let me just change one more thing here. Make this easier. Okay. Just before I get started, so there's lots of the Baltimore ecosystem study, as you'll find out, was a long-term sprawling project with many collaborators. And so I just wanted to start by acknowledging I'm going to be presenting the results from many people. I'll try and acknowledge some of them as I go along. But I'm also hoping that we're going to have some other talks that address some of the work that goes on in BES, and I'll try and refer to that as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the support from the National Science Foundation and the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. Okay, so what am I hoping to do? I'll give a little bit of an introduction, as to just what is BES, what is the bit of its history and its current status, which is so just some facts. But then I think a little more interesting is to talk about some of the intellectual roots and focus of the project, which I think is useful. I mean, I'm trying to, when I was structuring the talk, I was trying to think, okay, we're just getting started in BSEC, and we've got a lot of interesting things to talk about in BSEC. And so I'm going to introduce and define a little bit of what BES, the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, was. But I'm also going to try and focus on some things that I think are useful for us to be talking about in BSEC, and some of the intellectual roots and focus I think is interesting to talk about. And then some of the specific areas of research in BES that I think are relevant to BSEC. So a little bit about our watershed studies, and a little bit about some of our plot studies, and a little bit about some of our biodiversity studies. I'll hint a little bit at some of our soils research, but I think there are others in BES. So Kathy Slavitzine, Yesalonis, I'm hoping we'll give future talks in this series to talk more about the soils research, and then the social science research. I'll give a little hint of that, but again, there are others. Morgan Grove, in particular, I hope will Dexter Locke. We'll probably give a talk about some of the social science research, but I'm gonna hint at these things. But mostly, I'm going to talk about the watershed studies, which have been my focus in BES. All right. So, what is the Baltimore Ecosystem Study? So, the Baltimore Ecosystem Study was a component of the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research network from 1998 to 2022. I'm going to spend some time talking about how it became a part of the long-term ecological research network, and I'll spend less time about why it's no longer a part of the long-term ecological research network, which remains somewhat of a mystery to me and other components in other participants in BES. But nevertheless, needless to say, our LTER funding ended in 2022. Like BSEC, BES was a collaborative effort with many institutions involved. The Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies was the lead organization. Very strong partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. Let me get my nifty pointer going. And then many universities also.
Oncology.
Is there a question there, or is it someone needs to be muted? So in any case, and then there's the University of Virginia, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the University of Maryland. Lots of participants there. Lots of participants from Johns Hopkins and non-governmental organizations, in particular. Lots of work with the Parks and People Foundation. And like BSEC, BES had many components. So it had these watershed studies. We had lots of studies of the soils, vegetation, and hydrology that control the internal dynamics of the watersheds. There was an extensive program of modeling and spatial analysis, social science, historical analysis, and then coupled to a program of education, outreach, and understanding. And again, some of these I'm going to talk about, and others I think we'll have to get other talks to talk about a lot of the soils and the social science and some of the education work. But I'll touch on some of the things. So what is the current status of BES, right? So even though, this was quite interesting, the LTR funding ended gradually over a period from 2018 to 2022, but there was a strong sense that BES would continue as a research project, as a group, as a consortium, even without LTR funding. And many people said, boy, what am I going to do without BES as an intellectual platform? And it's been quite gratifying that we have these quarterly meetings to discuss scientific topics, and large numbers of new people, continue to show up for these meetings. And so there was a BES kind of functioned as this kind of dynamic intellectual platform for interaction and multidisciplinary studies. And so there was a strong sense that we want to continue with something called BES, and that has gone on. We also have funding, right? So many of us scrambled around to get funding to continue our long-term studies. So I lead a long-term research and environmental biology program, which, as I'll describe, continues some of the long-term watershed, terrestrial plot, and social survey data streams. And again, the LTR funding, was $1 million a year, and that's a lot to replace. So the LTREB is about $100,000 a year, or $120,000 a year. So it continues some of the work in BES, but not a lot of it. There's also a critical zone observatory network cluster that's led by Claire Welty, and again, I'm hoping that Claire will give a talk to describe that, because that underlies very relevant stuff to BSEC. And the Forest Service has a huge investment in urban ecology in general, and particularly in Baltimore with the Urban Field Station in Baltimore. And then we have BSEC, the DOE Integrated Field Laboratory. And then we have lots of BES, lots of people writing proposals, still writing proposals underneath the banner of BES. And so many of us have ongoing projects funded by the National Science Foundation, Division of Environmental Biology, or Macrosystems Biology. There are foundation grants, there's education grants. There's a lot of still BES work that's funded, but just we don't have the LTR funding. So I hope this is useful to describe what BES is and where it came from. It's a little bit dull, but I think it's important. The intellectual roots of the project are a little more interesting, and I'm going to throw some ideas out here, and I'm going to try and get so if I can see people. But of course, most people keep their screens up. What I always like to say to my students is that on these Zoom calls, we should be like children raised in the 50s in America, where you should be seen and not heard. Right. So there, I got Morgan to turn his camera on, because I really want to see Morgan's face as I run through this listing of history. History. Like we always like to say that predictions are hard, especially about the future. I would argue that coming to conclusions about history is quite difficult, especially if you're trying to come to conclusions about the past. So in any case, I'm going to throw some ideas out here, and we can all watch Morgan's face depending on, and we can get it, because he was here for a lot of it, so we can see how this goes over. But one of the most exciting things about, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network and BES is very strongly rooted in basic science ecology. And basic science ecology, when I went to graduate school in the late 40s, early 50s, there was no interest in studying human-dominated systems. Ecology was focused on natural systems, and with kind of a strict kind of avoidance of, we didn't want to study agriculture, we didn't want to study systems, we wanted to study natural assemblages and avoiding these human-dominated systems. And that kind of started to change in the 80s and 90s, and I give a tremendous amount of credit to Stuart Pickett and some of his colleagues who started saying, they were working in New York City, and they started saying, these urban systems are really interesting. They're systems where we can learn things about how ecosystems assemble and their structure and their function, and they're important because there's a lot of them. And so I really like the idea to acknowledge Pickett and his colleagues, in particular, Mark McDonnell and Rich Poyat, who was a graduate student at the time. And we've oftentimes talked about how we really want to make real progress on things. You got to get a great graduate student working on it. And so Poyat was a real driver of this, and has continued. And they so in addition to saying, okay, we should study urban systems, they also kind of pioneered the idea that we're not going to make much progress on these urban systems unless we study humans as components of the ecosystem. And this was hard, right? So I was raised in early environmental science where you had humans as outside drivers of things that go on in ecosystems. Humans kind of doing bad things to ecosystems. It's what I call the human suck approach to environmental science. We're cutting things down, we're digging things up, we're putting pesticides out. But we realized, starting in the 80s and the 90s, that a lot of our environmental problems we weren't going to solve unless we really understood human perceptions, human values, and how human perceptions and values influence actions. And they wrote a book on humans as components of ecosystems. And again, it's particularly noted that Pickett was a pretty traditional ecologist, pretty traditional plant ecologist, did a lot of work on disturbance. And you wouldn't have predicted in 1980 that here was a person who was going to be a leader in urban ecology. And it's just, to me, it's a very interesting history. He may disagree with this. Or anyone mentioned on the slide may disagree with it, but it's just some thoughts which I think are useful, because there has definitely been an interesting evolution in ecology that's very relevant to the work we're hoping to do in BSEC. So Pickett making a lot of noise about the need to study human systems, and the National Science Foundation decided to add urban sites to this long-term ecological research network, which was almost completely dominated by natural ecosystems. There was one ag site. And this was a big deal. And we assumed that Pickett was going to lead us on a proposal in New York City where we had been working. And much to our surprise, he came home one day, he said, no, we're going to do this in Baltimore rather than in New York City. And there are a variety of reasons for that. New York City is big and sprawling. And why is my hand up? Let me see if I can fix that. Let's see why I have to have my hand. Reactions. Okay, so so Baltimore was a bit more tractable to work in than New York City, but I would argue the main reason we came to Baltimore was because there was a strong base of social ecological research established in Baltimore by Bill Birch and Morgan Grove. And Morgan did his PhD here, and they had been working here, I guess, since the late 80s, early 90s. And again, it's the idea, if you really want to make progress, you put a great graduate student on it, and you can have this kind of transformative research. And Pickett, was looking for collaborators, and he sat down with Bill and Morgan, and he came home. He said, "Well, this is what we're doing," and that's where we've been ever since. And again, that's another interesting bit of history. And again, the last bit of history I would say that kind of talk about this evolution and intellectual evolution in ecology is that if you go to the Ecological Society of America meeting, urban ecology and urban ecosystems are all over the place. We have sessions. There was a session on urban ecology 1 and then urban ecology 2. And over the course of the last meeting, on the last day, I went to urban ecology 10. There were 10 sessions on posters and talks on urban ecology and urban ecosystems. We're attracting really bright students, a lot of excitement in urban ecology and urban ecosystems. And it's kind of, as an ecologist, I got a PhD in ecology. It's rewarding to see what I think is an intellectually intriguing and practically useful evolution of our discipline. So anyway, so that's a little bit of intellectual history, which I hope is interesting and useful. Okay, so we started with the LTER project in Baltimore, and we had 3 questions, and I think these old questions are worthwhile to revisit. There was 3 questions: structure, function, and people. And the structure and function questions are very common in ecology. So if we're studying ecosystems, we say, well, what's there? what's the vegetation, what are the animals, what are the soils, what's the hydrology, we say what's the structure. And that works in an urban system, but you've got to add a bunch of built structure and socioeconomic structure. So it's the old approach, but you've got to add some new elements to it. And then there's function. Function, again, very traditional in ecosystem ecology. What are the fluxes of energy and nutrients and water? But in an urban system, you have to add some new functions like the fluxes of population, the fluxes of information, the fluxes of dollars and energy. And so structure and function was a great way, we felt, to build a bridge between traditional ecosystem analysis and this urban ecosystem analysis. But again, the real challenge was the people question. So now we want to bring people into the system as a fundamental component of the system rather than as an external actor. And this I do a lot of biogeochemistry, and the development of biogeochemistry was really hard, where you had a lot of geochemists, they studied the Earth as a geochemical system, and they really didn't want to talk about biology, but the presence of like oxygen in the atmosphere and a bunch of anti-thermodynamic things made them say, well, we're going to have to talk to the biologists. It was really hard for the biologists to talk to the geologists and the chemists. But now we were going from biogeochemistry to biogeosociochemistry in these urban systems. And so we had to talk to social scientists. And some people thought that was hard. Other people thought that was just enormously entertaining. Me, Pickett, a few others, but this was the kind of intellectual and practical challenge, was to do structure, function, and people as an inherent part of the system. Over time, our questions have evolved. So we now talk much more about a social ecological system. We talk about adaptive processes. We talk about sustainability, right? And one thing that's important to notice is, in 1998, there was no sustainability office. Not only was there no sustainability office in Baltimore, there wasn't a sustainability office anywhere. So in the last 30 years or so, now every city's got a sustainability office and a sustainability plan. It's an amazing development. But at the time, in 1998, there wasn't much of that. And so the questions evolved. And these questions look a lot more like BSEC questions. To me, I look at the BSEC questions and I was thinking, yep, they make a lot of sense as our understanding and the flow of information from science to society has evolved. Our questions have evolved. And these were, I think, questions from 2014 or something like that. And so further, you get a little further evolution of these questions, and you end up with the questions that we have in BSEC, which I think is, I think that's nice. Okay, so there's enough introduction. Let me say a little bit about some of the details. So one of the big approaches that we took was the watershed approach. And I'll define the watershed approach because this is very fundamental in ecosystem ecology. It was very fundamental in BES, and it's very important in BSEC as well. So the idea with a watershed approach is the watershed is our unit of analysis. It's our basic it's our basic unit of nature that we study in ecosystem ecology. Like in medical science, people use rats or they use mice as a fundamental unit. People use Arabidopsis for genetics. So fruit flies. There are many kind of standard units of analysis in many disciplines. In ecosystem ecology, we use watersheds. And here's a picture of some watersheds. So a watershed is defined as an area of land that drains to a certain point. So you can see here's a forested watershed that's been cut, and all the rain that falls on this area, it drains to this stream and then drains to this point over here. Here's another watershed that drains to this point over here. Here's a forested watershed that hasn't been treated, but all the water in this is draining to this point over here. And the thing that's nice about the watershed approach is I can sample this stream. I can sample the quantity of the water and the quality of the water coming out of these watersheds and infer something about the function of those watersheds. It's very much analogous to urinalysis. So you go to a physician, and the physician will sample the quantity and the chemistry of the urine and use that to infer something about the health or the function of the system. And so the watershed approach, and this was a huge advance in ecosystem ecology that occurred in the 60s, because we're studying ecosystems, which are complex units of vegetation and soils and hydrologic processes and animals, pretty big. And we needed an experimental unit, kind of a realistic experimental unit that we could use to do ecosystem studies. And so the development of the watershed approach was was fundamental in ecosystem ecology in the 60s. These watersheds are at another long-term ecological research in New Hampshire, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. And so we were quite keen to apply this watershed approach in an urban system, and that's what we did in Baltimore. But just a little bit about, go back to the watershed approach. The idea is that we're studying ecosystems by analyzing the quantity and quality of the water. And it's super useful in long-term studies. So if I can measure these watersheds, the ones in New Hampshire, they've been sampled since the 60s, you can measure the long-term response to subtle changes, like your urine changes as you age, and is another example. The urinalysis analogy also holds in a disturbance and response mode. So if we apply disturbances to these watersheds, we analyze the response of the watersheds, and that then provides a platform for asking questions and testing hypotheses about, well, what caused the response? What internal dynamics underlie the response to a disturbance? And again, it's the same in medicine. If you have disease or some type of disturbance, it's going to show up as a symptom in the urine, and you're then going to say, well, okay, what might be causing that? So the watershed approach, fundamental in ecosystems, very useful in long-term studies, and still using in Baltimore today. So we wanted to apply this in Baltimore, and so you come to Baltimore, and Baltimore has well-defined watersheds. So you can see here's Baltimore City, here is the Gwynns Falls watershed, here is the Jones Falls watershed, and the Herring Run watershed. And what was really surprising to us and quite interesting to us, and this is the hidden hand of Morgan Grove and Bill Birch, is when we showed up in the 80s, there was a watershed association. There was a Gwynns Falls watershed association, there was a Herring Run watershed association, there was a Jones Falls watershed association. And we were like, how did that happen? Well, it turns out, that there was some link to these watershed studies at Hubbard Brook, and there was this idea that maybe if we want to study human-dominated systems and we want to incorporate social dynamics, maybe the watershed is kind of our fundamental unit for bringing together the social sciences and the biophysical sciences. And so we were very excited about that. And these watershed associations have evolved as well. And so Blue Water Baltimore is, and again, people can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the Gwynns Falls Watershed Association and the Jones Falls Watershed Association, the Herring Run, I keep getting these two mixed up, but they put them all together and they became Blue Water Baltimore, which is at least they're a BSEC participant, and to me a super impressive organization with deep roots in the city. We decided to focus on the Gwynns Falls because I don't know, we wanted to go to Orioles games. No, because it represented some real intellectual and practical advances to focus on the Gwynns Falls. It very nicely traverses, it starts in the suburban headwaters, crosses the old suburbs, and then goes into the dense part of the city here. It's just a great urban. The Gwynns Falls, I've developed quite an affection for the Gwynns Falls as a study unit. And again, here's land use in the Gwynns Falls. You've got a bunch of suburban land use in the headwaters. You cross into the old suburbs, and then you get into the dense downtown. And we set up a bunch of study sites along the Gwynns Falls. And so we started sampling. We did a lot of longitudinal sampling. So we sampled at Glendon, which is in the headwaters of the Gwynns Falls. We sampled about a quarter of the way down at Delight or Gwynn Brook. We sampled half the way down at Villanova, and then we sample way down at the bottom at Carroll Park, just before the water gets a little salty. So we have a nice series of longitudinal sites along the Gwynns Falls. And then we also have a series of smaller watershed comparisons. So we have out in Baltimore County, we have Pond Branch, which is a reference site. It's a completely forested reference site, and Baseman Run, which is low density exurban land use. These were sites that were studied starting in the 60s by Reds Woolman and others at Johns Hopkins. We have an agricultural site on the grounds of the McDonough School. We felt it was very important to have reference conditions. A forested reference to what were these ecosystems originally like. And we also felt we needed an agricultural reference, because you think about the last couple hundred years of land use, it was originally all forested. Then for a while, it was pretty much all agricultural. And now it's this mixture of forest and agriculture and suburban. And so we felt it was pretty important to have these end members, the forest and the ag end members. And then we also have Dead Run, which is a much more urban site. And you'll hear more about Dead Run when Claire Welty gives this talk. She has just a fantastic series of projects in Dead Run. But again, the monitoring in Dead Run is part of BES as well. So we've got longitudinal sites, and we have a bunch of smaller watersheds to do these comparisons of different land use and land cover. We have a lot of focus on nitrogen, and for a couple of reasons, partially practical and then partially basic science, right? There's a tremendous amount of interest in nitrogen pollution, especially in the Chesapeake Bay. And so it really grabs your attention if you talk about nitrogen. But then as an intellectual platform to understand the nitrogen cycle, you have to understand the way an ecosystem works. So the watershed ecosystem you can look at it as a series of sources of nitrogen, sinks are nitrogen. And so the focus on nitrogen had a practical value, but it also was a strong intellectual platform for integration between hydrology and ecology and social science and biogeochemistry. The focus on nitrogen is useful for that. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit of long-term data. So we started sampling in the fall of 1998. We started sampling weekly in the fall of 1998 at those sites along the Gwynns Falls. And here's data from 3 of those sites. And this is nitrate concentrations. This is the most common form of reactive nitrogen in the environment. This is the great scourge of eutrophication in the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have 3 lines. So down at the bottom, you have the forested site. And the forested site has very low nitrate concentrations. It has a very interesting seasonal pattern that John Duncan got his PhD trying to figure out that seasonal pattern. But there's no surprise there. The nitrate concentrations in forests are low. Forest ecosystems are known to have very clean water and low nitrogen concentrations. The other line that's not a surprise particularly is the top line. So this is the agricultural site, and it has very high nitrate concentrations. And this isn't a particular surprise either, because we've studied ag sites all over the world, and they have very high nitrate concentrations. The most interesting part of this graph is this. This is the suburban site. This is the headwaters of the Gwynns Falls. And this is the great unknown that we were addressing in BES. And the long-term data is a wonderful platform for asking questions and testing hypotheses. So why does the suburban watershed have much higher nitrate concentrations than the forest watershed? And why does it have much lower nitrate concentrations than the agricultural watershed? Why does it have this very regular seasonal pattern? Why do we see these long-term declines and then stabilization over periods of years? The long-term data is just fantastic you see a signal, and then you stare at the signal and you say, well, what could be causing that? And you propose ideas and you test hypotheses, and it drives the research forward. And so much of BES has been spent figuring out what's causing these differences and what's causing these patterns. And there's a lot of biogeochemistry there, but there's also a bunch of social science there. And so, for instance, this graph, which I have been showing people for 20 years, gets me in a lot of trouble. And so can anyone figure out why is this graph problematic in a social ecological sense? Anyone got an idea? Someone out there must have an idea. Unmute yourself and shout out why this is a problematic graph. I'll take a sip of tea while you think. I teach undergraduates, so I am prepared to just wait till the end of time until someone chimes in. What are the policy implications of this graph that might be problematic in terms of, let's say, solving eutrophication in the Chesapeake Bay? Let's see if I got anything in the chat.
Well, we've always had a conflict in Pennsylvania between ag and urban about who's going to pay for it and who's going to have access to it.
There you go. That's it. Thank you, Shirley. It basically points the finger at agriculture, right? And it kind of says, well, if we could just get rid of all those damn farms, we could clean up the Chesapeake Bay. And of course, that's very, that's a problematic answer, because we need agriculture and we like agriculture, and especially in our urbanizing landscapes, we want agriculture in the landscape. And so right away, I had just an interesting biogeochemical story that I thought was a lot of fun. But what I really had was a much more interesting biogeosociochemical story. And to me, that's kind of the why urban ecology is exciting. So thank you, Shirley. But this is the long-term data, and we're continuing to collect these data, and they continue to provide a signal that's interesting to puzzle over. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention to was this graph on the other side. So on this graph over here, I'm plotting percent nitrogen retention versus precipitation, and this is over about 20 years of data. So nitrogen retention we calculate by saying, what are all the sources of nitrogen, the inputs from the atmosphere and from fertilizer, and then what are the outputs we measure in the stream, and we can calculate this nitrogen retention, which is a very important ecosystem service. We really want these watershed ecosystems to hold on to nitrogen and not deliver it to the Chesapeake Bay. And so you can see forested watersheds have you see two things. You see this graph shows an interaction between climate and land use. So you can see that nitrogen retention is very high in forests, and it's much lower in suburban and in agricultural and in urban systems. Their ability to hold on to nitrogen is greatly reduced because of a variety of changes. And Mike, do you have a question?
I do. So the thing that sticks out to me in graph A, I can wait if it's more beneficial, but on panel A is the jump, it looks like in 2002 in the agricultural nitrates. So I was just wondering what caused that.
Horses, right? So there are horses at the McDonough School, and I think they increased the number of horses, and they were recycling their own manure. And again, there was an extensive scientific discussion of what the hell in 2002. And so the idea, we're pretty sure it was horses. We had for a long time, I think Martin Schmidt retired, just a delightful earth science teacher collaborator at the McDonough School. It was really, and he got the students looking at the data. We had a lot of fun with the McDonough School.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let's go back to nitrogen retention. So these forests, so you see the interaction between land use and that these forested systems, they're intact. They have lots of biology, lots of biotic control over the abiotic environment. So they hold on to nitrogen quite much better than either the suburban systems, the ag systems, or these more urban systems over here. So you see a land use effect, but you also see a climate effect. And when it rains more, it flushes nitrogen through these systems, and nitrogen retention goes down. And there's an interaction between land use and climate, and that the human-dominated systems are much more vulnerable to this climate effect. So as precipitation goes up, retention really drops very fast in these urban systems. It dropped pretty fast in the suburban systems. It does drop in the forested systems. It's hard to see, but this is a statistically significant negative slope. So retention in the forest does significantly go down as precipitation goes up, but it's the interaction between climate and land use that's really interesting and creates this vulnerability. We spent a lot of time talking about this because this is really a nightmare for people trying to reduce nitrogen to the Chesapeake Bay, because precipitation is going up, the intensity of precipitation is going up. So I'm working. You have these people, in the city and the county and across the basin are working super hard to implement best management practices and reduce nitrogen inputs. But all the time, the climate is changing, driving this nitrogen through the system. And so it's almost like we talk about like shooting at a moving target, or shooting at a moving target while you're jumping up and down because the climate's changing. And this is a good example of that. And again, this really emerges clearly if you have 20 years of data to show it. So we had those long-term watershed studies, and they were coupled, and this is another fundamental component of BES, was a long-term social survey. So starting in the 90s, we started distributing a survey to a couple of thousand people across the watershed. We asked a series of questions about people's perceptions and their values and their actions. And again, Morgan Grove or Dexter Locke can talk about this in much more detail. But the long-term social survey it's a novel and very exciting piece of data. And I'll just share two pieces from this. So one is we've been asking people since the late 90s, do you live in a watershed? And so the question, this is originally a telephone survey, is we now do this as a web survey. But you see, the person on the phone says a watershed is defined as the area of land that drains to a certain point. Do you live in a watershed? And the answer is no, I don't. I don't live in a watershed, right? So more than 50% of people, like around between 50 and 60% of people say, no, I don't live in a watershed. And this was a thought-provoking result, because we had the idea that the watershed idea and the watershed approach was going to be this great integrator between the biophysical and social sciences. Certainly, it had helped us integrate across geochemical sciences, but the watershed concept maybe was not as useful as we thought in a bio-geo-sociochemical context. And that's kind of an enduring question. Interestingly, we've asked this question to people in cities across the country, and in 6 different cities we've applied this and again, the recognition of what a watershed is and where people sit in a watershed is not widespread. If you go to arid places like Phoenix, it's even worse. If you ask people in Phoenix if they live in a watershed, only like 10 or 20% of people think they live in a watershed, which makes sense. In arid areas, awareness of watersheds is not as marked as it is in humid places like the East. But this is an interesting result, and it kind of challenges some of our fundamental assumptions about multidisciplinary research. The other thing we've been tracking is a willingness to pay for a tax increase to support water quality improvements, and that goes up and it goes down. It's pretty high. For the most part, people are pretty willing to support increases to get real benefits in water quality. It varies with education level, and the more education people have, the more willing they are to pay more taxes to support water quality. Of course, if you then think about, well, who's got the biggest impact on water quality? Oftentimes, people with more money are maybe using more landscaping, or they're traveling more, or whatever. But again, this interaction between education and willingness to pay is interesting. The social survey is just a world of interesting results, and I'm hoping we'll get Morgan or Dexter to get to talk about it more later. Here's just a paper that just came out this year using the data. So the survey is we know where people are, right? So here's all our survey responses over a 20-year period or so, and we were able to look at relationships between people's perceptions of air quality and water quality and relate that to what's around them. So if you ask people, so people who think that the air, so this is basically forest cover, and concerns about water quality or concerns about air quality go down as there's more canopy cover, right? And that makes sense. If there's more canopy cover, people think the environmental quality is pretty high, and so they have less perception of problems with air quality, also problems with safety. On the other hand, water quality, people's perceptions of problems with water quality are increased if there's more water nearby. And so some of our streams maybe don't look so good. Some of our lakes and ponds don't look so good. And so here's the survey allows us, because it's spatially explicit, to look at the links between what's around people and their perceptions. And again, perceptions, values, actions are at the root of much of what we do. Okay, so
Peter.
Yeah.
So can you go back to?
Yeah.
So what are the 2 axes or the 2 colors represent?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure it is. So this is the axis here is forest cover, and the axis here is water cover, and
the blue curve's water and the green is air.
Yeah, or perceptions of problems with it. All right. So as forest cover goes up, we have less concerns about air quality, and we have less concerns about water quality. Nope. Okay, so sorry. The green line is vegetation, and the blue line is water. And this is the probability that you think it's a problem, right? So as forest cover goes up, you get less concerns of, and Anyway, it's a complicated graph, but you're getting basically is if you have more forest cover, you have less perceptions of problems with air quality and less perceptions of safety problems. And as you have more increasing water nearby, you have more perceptions of problem with water quality. And this graph is definitely unnecessarily complicated, but that's what it shows. Okay. All right. Sorry for that confusion. So the basic watershed work that I've described, sampling sites weekly, and doing the social survey are covered and will continue under the LTREB, Long-Term Research in Environmental Biology project. And the current hypotheses governing the LTREB are that the flashiness of urban stream hydrology is going to decrease over the next 20 years. We are hypothesizing that at concentrations, exports of nitrogen and metals are going to decline over the next 20 years. And on the social side, we're hypothesizing that watershed and ecosystem knowledge will increase along with willingness to support watershed improvements. These are 20-year hypotheses, and I put them up here just to kind of remind you that these data collection, the long-term data collection on the watersheds and the social survey will continue as BES goes along. Okay, so I'm going to run out of time, and so I'm just going to kind of cover just a couple of the other long-term data components in BES that I think are relevant to BSEC. So one of our main focuses, which I think is going to be useful to BSEC, is the idea of focusing on the interface between the terrestrial environment and aquatic components of the landscape, which is riparian zones. And so here's a picture of a natural riparian zone with a whole web of interconnections between the stream and the riparian zone. So you have trees in a vegetated riparian zone are adding organic matter to the stream. You have a shallow water table, so you have interaction between the water table and the surface ecosystem. You have water can flood from the stream, and there's just a web of interaction in these riparian zones that's very important in mediating the interaction between the terrestrial and aquatic components of the landscape. Now, in urban areas, that web of interactions is degraded by you put impervious surface in the watersheds, you move water into these stream channels with great energy, and you end up with this incision of the stream channel. You end up with degradation of the riparian vegetation, and just this loss of function. This riparian zones are supposed to be the great mediator of the interface between the terrestrial and aquatic components of the landscape. And that's destroyed by urbanization, and a lot of this dynamic of this geomorphic change associated with urbanization was worked out by Reds Wollman and students at Hopkins in the 60s and the 70s. We set up some long-term monitoring, some long-term studies of these riparian areas, and I have working with a master's student, Brittany Washington, who's going to do her PhD work, but she's just finishing up her master's. And so we have a network of riparian sites, and we've been collecting data on riparian water tables and groundwater chemistry at those sites for 20 years or so. And so here I have a bunch of sites, and the blue line is the average groundwater depth over time, which has gotten closer to the surface over the past 20 years. This is an interesting result because the urbanization effect is this incision and degradation of the riparian zone, which really lowers the water table, which cuts the connection between the stream and the land. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that connectivity is reestablishing, and that water tables have been rising over time, which is kind of an encouraging result. Could be a result of climate, probably is also a result of all the best management practices that have been installed in these watersheds to reverse the effects of urbanization on streams and riparian zones. So we see this change in water table levels over the last 20 years or so, and that's accompanied by changes in groundwater chemistry. So this is the nitrate concentration in groundwater has significantly declined over the past 20 years. This is another encouraging result because we know as these riparian zones get wetter, right? So you go back, you look at this nice wet riparian zone with a shallow water table, there's lots of opportunities for nitrogen to disappear. Plants can take it up, or it can be denitrified or converted into gases by microbes. So our long-term data on riparian zones shows a change in the water tables and a changes in the groundwater chemistry. We also see changes in phosphorus chemistry. So here's the same, this is the same water table graph over 20 years, and the water tables have gotten closer, and the phosphate concentrations in the groundwater have gone up. Now, this also makes good biogeochemical sense because anaerobic soils mineralize phosphorus. This is not a positive result in a water quality sense, and that phosphorus is also a contributor to eutrophication. But it supports the idea that there has been some really interesting long-term changes at the interface between the terrestrial and the aquatic environment. In Baltimore, water tables are going up, and it's affecting the nitrogen and phosphorus chemistry. So this is something, if we like to think about control points in the landscape or hotspots in the landscape or places where we might really want to focus on interventions with stream restoration or best management practices, here the long-term data, I think, provides an interesting platform for some, we're going to continue to do this work, but I think there are some implications for our opportunities in BSEC with the riparian studies. One other thing, last thing, and this is the last thing, and then I'll stop, is we also have long-term studies of greenhouse gas fluxes. So we have a network of forest sites, we have a network of rural forest sites, some urban forest sites, and we have some lawns or some grass sites. We have been making monthly measurements of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide flux at these sites since 1998. And we've seen some really interesting results. So you look at rural forests have a very strong ability to take up methane. So an important ecosystem service, they're pulling methane, which is a greenhouse gas, they're pulling it out of the atmosphere. And it's long been known that temperate forests have a pretty strong ability to pull methane out of the atmosphere. The rural forests do it much better than the urban forests, right? In the urban forests, the methane capacity has been reduced, we think, because of exposure to the urban atmosphere. And then the lawns have no ability to pull methane out of the atmosphere. And we think this is a mixture of physical disturbance and also a nitrogen enrichment effect. So methane uptake, which is an important flux, it varies a lot within the urban area. And there's a lot of urbanization effect. There's an effect of the urban atmosphere, and then there's an effect of urban land use change. The other thing we've seen is that the uptake has declined over the last 20 years. So in the rural forests, we've seen its decline. We see its decline in the urban forest. It hasn't changed much in the lawns, but there is probably a positive slope there. And we've seen this also, we also make the same measurements at the Hubbard Brook long-term ecological research site. And so we think that there's a regional decline in methane uptake, probably driven by increases in soil moisture. But again, in BSEC, we're measuring greenhouse gas fluxes. And so I think I want to mention this because our long-term greenhouse gas flux measurements, I think, are useful for BSEC. We also measure nitrous oxide emissions. And again, we have an interesting and somewhat surprising long-term pattern here in that there's been marked declines over the last 20 years in nitrous oxide emissions. We see it from both forests, which are the pink dots, and then we also see it in our lawn plots, which is the blue dots. And again, this is something we also see at Hubbard Brook. We think this is probably driven by declines in atmospheric deposition, but it's kind of an interesting pattern. And again, relevant to BSEC, where we're interested in measuring these greenhouse gas fluxes. It raises really interesting questions about lawns. I'm going to talk about some of our orchid lawns, but I don't have time. And so I'm going to skip to the end so we can have some time for questions. If we have well, I could go on for a long time here. I'm going to skip all this. I guess I just wanted to do say one more thing about just one more thing that's been fundamental to BES is studies of biodiversity. And so we've been involved in a study comparing different types of residential land uses. And this is a 6-city study, right? So we've been comparing Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And in each of those cities, we've been comparing high intensity lawns, passive lawns, which don't get any fertilizer. We've been sampling lawns certified by the National Wildlife Federation, and then yards with xeriscaping or rain gardens. And I couldn't talk about BES without talking about the biodiversity. And so this is a current effort where we've got these different yard types and we're sampling plants. We measure all the plants, we measure birds, we measure bees, we measure ground insects. And the result is that it's really interesting. So we compare, these are reference forest sites. These are spontaneously developing interstitial sites, we call them. And here's our yards. These are data from Baltimore. Miriam Avens' yard we've been studying for many, many years. But what you see is there's lots of plant species in the residential yards in Baltimore, higher numbers of plant species in the yards than there are in our reference habitats. There's lots of birds in the yards in Baltimore. Again, here's forests, here's these interstitial areas, and the yards have lots of bird species in the yards. And then we also have organic soil, organic matter. It's lower in the yards than in the reference areas, but there's lots of organic matter in soils in residential yards in Baltimore. And again, so biodiversity is really important. When we did our community outreach, they're interested in plant species and they're interested in birds. And the BES data says there's really a lot of plants, there's a lot of birds in the residential spaces, which is super important from a management point of view and really kind of useful, I think, as an opportunity for interacting with the community. Okay, so some conclusions. I hope I've given a decent introduction to what the Baltimore ecosystem study is, to make the case that it provides a strong platform for much of the work that we're hoping to do in BSEC. I think the watershed studies, the riparian studies, the greenhouse gases, social survey, our biodiversity work. I think much of what we hope to do in BSEC can build on this work. And from the other point of view, we're excited about BSEC, right? So for those of us who've been working, in Baltimore for a long time, personally, I've been dreaming about flux towers. Now we're getting flux towers. I've been dreaming about having community interaction faculty like we have in BSEC. So there's a bunch of things in BSEC that are just very exciting, and so we're excited about it, and we hope that it's useful to others in the project. And so that's all. I will stop. And we have some time for questions, I hope.
I think we do. Peter, do you just want to call on folks? I think Jason.
I see Jason's got a question. And Chris.
Hey, Peter, great talk. I had a question. So the fluxes are from chamber measurements on ground, I would assume?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
Very cool. And so then the methane flux is primarily due to microbials rather than
Yep.
okay,
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. And again, I like your flux tower picture behind you. So we've been going out every month, for 20 years to these sites and measuring these fluxes in the ground and dreaming about a flux tower. Now you're going to get.
Yeah, we've been thinking about putting a tower over a lawn too, because we've got the turf grass lawn. So we're working right now on potentially moving one of our towers and finding a location for a turf tower, because I think that'd be very interesting. And those are valuable data.
Yeah, super interesting. Chris?
Yeah, I was curious. I put a question in the chat basically saying, when was the last time were the forest ecosystems unperturbed by humans? Or the same thing could go for the watersheds. I guess, what's the baseline that it would, if no humans were here, and how would that change our perspective as to what we're thinking about?
So that's I love this question. It's something that we've spent a lot of time talking about over time, right? So we felt the need for a reference condition, right? So we took this idea that, and I said this, that in 1700, and we have maps of this, in 1700, the area was pretty much forested, completely forested. Then by about 1850, it was really dominated by agriculture. And now you've got this mix of relic agriculture, relic forest, and then a bunch of urban and suburban land use. And that's a grievous oversimplification in many ways, right? So for one thing, we realized that in 1700 or previous to 1700, there was a lot of the population was much higher. Like we like to think, well, there's this assumption in ecology that the landscape was empty. We now know that that's not true. There were indigenous people managing the landscape pretty aggressively. And so this question of there's no such thing as an unmanaged forest, or our concepts of an unmanaged forest are way out of date. And that's been to me an impressive advance in our scholarship and also our kind of awareness. And so there's that part of it. And then the question is, there was indigenous management of the forest that changes our concept of what the reference state is. And then there's all kinds of other disturbances, right? So in the forest, our reference watersheds, which are in the Oregon Ridge Park, there's been gypsy moss, there's been deer, there's been invasive species. So there's been a lot of disturbance or management of our reference sites. That said, the forested watershed remains a biogeochemical touchstone, right? Just because the water, the hydrology is much different than the more human-dominated systems. The chemistry is much different than human-dominated systems. The biology is much different. So it is a reference condition, but it's a very imperfect reference condition. And we've spent a lot of time driving around looking for other reference sites, and they're very hard to find in Maryland.
Thank you.
Thanks. Samia has her hand up.
Oh, Samia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It really brings decades of research that you've been doing into a very comprehensible. I'm curious about one of the statements in one of the in the middle of the presentation. You mentioned that the people are the biggest challenge. What makes people a challenge for researchers?
Yeah, so I think it was the integration between biophysical and social sciences. And so I was referring to the people this was kind of an intellectual or academic challenge to our science. And I in many ways I consider myself a biogeochemist, and I spent a lot of time looking at the development of biogeochemistry, where you had geologists who were thinking about the formation of the earth and the formation of the atmosphere. And they realized, back in the 40s or in the 20s that, boy, we're going to have to talk to the biologists because there's all this oxygen in the atmosphere. And they were unhappy about that, but they did it. You look at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, Johns Hopkins is a classic example of a well-evolved department. And so, but then, the challenge that we face now is this moving from a biogeochemical system to a biogeosociochemical system. And that's involved that we need to really do integrative science with social scientists, and they use different words and they use different approaches. And writing proposals with social scientists has been so much fun. It's been challenging, but we frame questions differently, and the approaches are differently, and so that has been an intellectual challenge. And to me, the great advance, and you see it in BSEC, is the realization. Well, if you really want to do that, maybe you should start with the people. Right, so the first thing we did in BSEC was we said, let's bring the community in and see what are their perceptions and what are their values, what do they think we should study, and we weren't doing that in 1998. And to me, that's been a huge intellectual and practical advance that's helping us to do that integration between the biophysical and the social sciences. And it was just great. It was great to see it in BSEC.
I have a follow-up question. Do you think? Because it's easier to communicate between ecological sciences and social scientists, right? And even though there is a little bit of ease there, you're still switching from one mode of science to another. Do you think that there may be merit in bypassing social scientists and going straight to people, so that we can truly start learning directly without the lens of science? And the reason why I'm posing this question, the more I work with communities, the more I'm recognizing as an architect and urban designer by the nuanced tricks that people play with the adjusting to climate change, is that no matter what we do, no matter how hard I, as an embodied privileged person, I cannot think outside the box like the people are. So if we are really serious about transformation in society to adjust to climate change, perhaps we need to make room for people who have been at the receiving end of environmental injustices, because they seem to have better tools than us with our drones and all technologies to really live and adjust to climate change?
So I agree 100% that we need to put the people first, and I think we've done that in BSEC, where we started with the community and we got their perceptions first, and I also see it at the long-term ecological research site that I work at in New Hampshire, where we study winter climate change, and we sat with the ski area operators and the maple sugar producers, and we said, what are your perceptions of climate change? And boy, we learned a lot from talking to them. And so I agree, for much of this work, we want to start with the communities and the people. I still think we need the scientists, though. And in particular, I think we need the social scientists. In my 25 years of working in Baltimore, boy, I've learned a lot talking to the social scientists, things that again, about how people perceive and what do they value, how do they form, how do their perceptions and values influence their behaviors. And by the same token, I think we need the biophysical scientists to measure, well, just how hot is it and how dirty is the water. But I think our science is just better now because we're recognizing exactly what you said. But I still think we need the science.
So I'm not sure about it because, and again, I am making that transition myself, so I don't have the answers at all. I only have questions. Because it seems to me that when we talk about people, we immediately go to perceptions. And that's a serious problem. People don't just have perceptions.
I don't think
People have embodied experiences, and they are the experts. And I think that that's the transition, at least I am doing in my work. How do I take off the hat of the expert and put it on the actual expert?
I think that there's a range. Some people study and go to perception. Some people go to attitudes. I could ask all of you, how many of you think that drunk driving is a bad idea? You'd all say you think it's a bad idea. Then I'd say, how many of you have done it? 60% of the hands go up, right? So what is the connections between perceptions and attitudes and behaviors? Like these are things that are important social science wise, but social ecological science wise. And we need to understand histories. You can't understand Baltimore without understanding the long-term history and the continued presence of institutionalized racism, right? So there's many different, I think the key is there's many different ways of knowing, and it's not an either or situation. And these are the kind of fun conversations Peter and I've had for 25 years.
Well, that's what I was just going to say, right? So to bring up this question, I'm just super glad, Samia, that you bring up this question, because it's a legitimate question. It's a hard one. And if you have a long-term project, you get to resolve some of these hard questions. And again, I was going to say the same thing. Morgan and I have set out a series of debates, whether it's stadiums or public spending on stadiums, or the nature of watershed research and the meaning of watersheds. And if you bring up really hard questions and you get to talk about them, then I think we'll all learn things. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think we all have to go to our 11 o'clock meeting.
Yes. So thank you so much, Peter, for doing such a great breakdown of what the BS is. And I hope that BSEC will aspire to having the same kind of longitudinal data 20 years from now. So thank you so much.
All right.